Hi everyone. Thanks for joining the sixth tutorial for forests and their management. And yeah, today we're going to be talking about the this week's lectures. And I'm Geetika Agarwal. I am a PhD scholar at the Center for Ecological Sciences. And let's keep this session as interactive as possible. You guys can ask me any doubts that you have anywhere. And I'll mostly be recapping whatever happened during this week. And in the end, we'll have a short little quiz for everybody. And yeah, if you have any doubts right now about the lectures from the week, you can ask me now as well. And okay, let's start. So, this week was mostly discussing how we can protect our forests, what threats our forests are facing, one major threat, which is forest fires, and then what are the different forest laws that we have in India for protecting our forests. Okay, so this was majorly what was discussed during this week. And moving on to what are some threats to forests, we have like two major categories of threats to forests. One are some natural threats, and one are some artificial or like man made threats, like anthropogenic factors that can affect forests. And when it comes to natural threats, as you can see in these images, you can probably make out that there is something like a frost issue happening in this image. So basically, this is frost damage, where you see that if the weather's is too cold, it's too chilly. Then at nights, if the temperature goes too down, then the water or the dew that's on the plant can actually freeze up. And if it freezes and forms snow or it forms frost onto the plant, it can actually lead to damage to the plant leaves or the plant in general. And why that is happening is that the water is freezing on the leaves, on the leaf surface, or even if the temperature drops too down, that the water inside the plant cell starts to freeze. Then as the water freezes, it can lead to expansion, because when water freezes to ice, it usually expands. So as that expansion happens, it can actually lead to cell rupture, because there's a if now water inside inside the cell freezes and it expands in volume, that can actually cause the s- a lot of pressure on the cell wall and the cell membrane, and eventually can lead to cell rupture and cell death inside these leaves. So that is a frost damage that can happen in forests if the temperature at the night goes too down. Then second one you see in this image here, what is happening is it's because of wind throw. If the wind is too fast in a area, it can actually exert a lot of pressure, like we discussed in the lecture. We were talking about the height of the trees and canopy height, and how much pressure, how a tree acts like a cantilever, and how much pressure applies on the tree because of wind. Now, because of wind throw, the pressure can be too much. It can either lead to uprooting of the tree or breaking of the tree, or the bark of the tree, and basically leads to uh, tree damage and eventually damage to the forests, because some established trees can be lost. Then there is insect or pest manifestation. As you can see in this image, a lot of plants can get infected by insects or pests. And pests could be like fungi or like these microscopic infestations. These can actually lead to rot and damage of the leaves and plants in general. So that can be a cause of threat to the forest, because if the plants undergo some insect infestation, then that can lead to damage to the plants and then the forests in general. Again, disease spread, similar issues. If the disease starts spreading through forests or through the trees, then it can eventually lead to all the trees dying out in that area, and it will take some time for the younger generation to come up. So that will again lead to forest damage. Then there can be damage caused by animals. So in forests, for example, say an elephant is going around in a forest zone, and then if the trees come in the way of the elephant, usually they can actually, if they're aggressive or even if they're not, they can uproot certain trees, they can trample down certain other trees and bushes, and that can lead to some amount of damage to the forest. On the other hand, even animals like monkeys, langurs, macaques, all of these, when they move through the trees, when they're jumping around in the trees, they can lead to a lot of destruction to the branches, to well established trees, and that can lead to damage to the forest. And the last is invasive species. As you might be aware of what are invasive species, we'll be also talking further in this lecture what they are. So, invasive species, as they spread through the jungle and they might overtake the native species, then that leads to a big threat to the forests because we are losing our native fauna and flora to these invasive species, mostly flora when we're talking about forests. So we're losing a lot of these native vegetation to these invasive species, which are spreading like wildfire or spreading um, very fast through the forests, and they're overtaking our natural vegetation. And the last but not the least is climate change. Um, and forest fires. Here you can see in this image there is forest fires as well. So climate change, as you know, the climate has been changing quite abruptly now. It's changing quite fast in the recent years. Because of these climate change, a lot of the biodiversity in the forests gets affected, even plants and animals both. A lot of these species are acclimatized to a certain temperature range, to a certain rainfall range. And if there's a lot of climate change, say a lot of rainfall is happening, or the monsoon is getting, shifted in times, then that can actually affect the different activities, the floration, when the flowers come up in the tree, when the fruits form. And because of this, it can affect how insects are, getting affected, because insects which live on these trees also follow a phenology. Phenology is the time of events, like the time in which the events are occurring through the year. So if, say, the rains shift, then accordingly the plants will shift their flowering and their fruition. Accordingly the insects will have to shift, and if the insects also shift in time, like when they're emerging, then that will affect, in turn will affect the, for example, the birds or other insect dependent animals in the area. Because birds also time when they have their clutches, when they have their broods, eggs, and the babies coming out, because they usually feed on insects, or they usually feed on the berries of the trees. And if that time is shifting, so everything, the entire phenology of the jungle shifts. And because it is kind of like a flow chart, like one thing is affecting the next and the next thing is affecting the next, it actually leads to some cascading effects. So climate change also is a threat to forests. And last but not the least, as I said, are forest fires. So you know that there's a lot of natural causes that can lead to forest fires, and forest fires are a direct threat to the forests, because there is full on fire destroying the entire forest stands. Right? So these are some natural causes that affect forests. Now, some threats which are man made that are affecting forests, as you can see in these images, there is illicit felling of trees or logging. You can see in this image a lot of trees have been cut down, either for timber purposes or for firewood or for anything for that matter. They might be just clearing out land to start out agriculture or build some buildings. So basically any illegal felling of trees is a threat to the forest. Second is illegal mining. There could be companies, or there could be industries which are going inside the forest, and they're mining the areas for sand. They might be using it for construction purposes, and because there's a lot of soil and sand in the forest, they could be mining that, or they could be mining other resources in that forest area. So any illegal mining is a major threat to the forest, because entire forests are being destroyed or cleared in order to carry out this mining. Then there is illegal grazing. A lot of people, because okay, so there are pasture lands, there are grasslands that naturally exist in the ecosystem, but because humans more or less largely consider grasslands as wastelands, which is um, another thought process that we are living by, but we should not be following that. Mostly these grasslands are not wastelands. They are very important part of the ecosystem, and they have their own biodiversity that they sustain. But usually they're considered as wastelands, and they're usually cleared, and or they are built upon. Something or the other is going on, and now these are not available for grazing for the cattle. And people then take their cattle into the forests, and when there is a lot of cattle, they can be feeding onto the new saplings, the younger saplings in the forest, and eventually these younger saplings cannot establish into trees. And if that is happening, only be left with older trees in the forest, and no new trees will be establishing. So this illegal kind of grazing is also a threat to the forest. Then there is encroachment. So when people are encroaching on forest land, they may be people who have their fields right next to the forest area, and little by little they'll keep expanding these fields, expecting that nobody will actually notice, and they are able to encroach into the forest zones. They'll either clear the forest, or burn out that zone, and then they'll start agriculture there. So it can either be for agriculture, or it can be for building, for building highways or this or that. Mostly highway building is not encroachment because that is happening by the government, but if it's illegally happening, then that's some sort of an encroachment, which is again a threat to the forest because they're destroying the forest to use that land. Other kinds of threats, more man-made threats basically, are one of them is degradation as pollution. Here you can see in this image a lot of plastic waste has been dumped into the forest area. This is like pollution. Other forms of pollution are basically if you have, for example, say an industry right next to a forest area, and that industry is carrying out some of its chemical reactions and maybe some processing, and it's like for example, it is releasing a lot of chemicals into the air, and these chemicals eventually get so eventually when the rains come, these chemicals dissolve in water, and there's some sort of an acid rain that falls down on the adjacent areas, which also includes, for example, forests. Then forests will actually get affected by this acid rain because the plants in that area, they can um, because they depend on these rains, and also because they take up this water, they're eventually going to be taking up these chemicals along with that, and they can get affected or harmed by these chemicals, which will lead to some sort of a degradation of the forest. So pollution, degradation are big threats to the forests, and they're very eminent threats right now when humans are carrying out so much industrialization is happening and so much processing and stuff is happening. And also with our vehicular transport, we are releasing a lot of sulfides, a lot of carbon monoxide, and all of that into the atmosphere, which leads to a lot of pollution. And like you can see here, a lot of garbage dumping, a lot of landfilling is happening in free areas near cities. So that's again pollution and degradation. Then there's poaching, as you can see in this image, when there's some illegal hunting of animals happening either for the trade of their skins or for the trade of their teeth, for example, in the case of elephants, and for example, these tiger hides, all these things basically, or maybe people are hunting them to use them for some medicinal purposes. So a lot of this poaching is a big threat to forests and biodiversity. Then again, these three threats which we came across in the natural category as well, but there are also threats which can be anthropogenic: invasive species, climate change, and forest fires. Forest fires can also be caused due to anthropogenic factors. Humans can lead to forest fires. Climate change is, as we know, is humans have played a huge role in how climate change has been happening. So again, climate change is indirectly also caused by humans. And invasive species, you might be aware that mostly it's humans which bring in these species either for decorative purposes or for medicinal purposes. They think that okay, fine, we can grow this, if it's growing in some other continent, some other country, we can grow it in our area also. And they don't realize that it can actually turn out to be an invasive species because they are just bringing it in to maybe grow in their gardens as a decorative piece, but it then spreads around um, throughout areas, and it basically destroys the native population, it overtakes the native vegetation and spreads. So these three threats, they fall into both categories, natural and man-made. Okay. Now, invasive species. We've been talking about invasive species in both these categories, so we must know what are invasive species. So, is anybody here aware of what are invasive species? Like, how would you define invasive species? Does anybody have any idea? You can either unmute yourself or you can type it out in the chat box. Do you have any idea of what is the definition of invasive species, or what gets classified as invasive? Anybody has an idea of what are invasive species? Species which are not indigenous, introduced for some purposes. Correct. Um, Very good. So basically, invasive species are species which are not native to that area. As you said, they're not indigenous. They have been introduced to this area for some purposes. As I said, these could be some decorative purposes that you just like looking at the species and you want it in your home. So you bring it back from wherever you've gone. So, or in the case of like British colonial rule, they introduced a lot of species into India because they enjoyed looking at them either in Africa or in England, and they thought that okay, fine, we want them with us in India as well. So they brought a lot of species with them, which later turned out to be invasive. So a foreign species put in like a new area is not invasive by the start, but it can become invasive because it can start taking over the native vegetation. So it might so turn out that this species is better at utilizing the resources of this new foreign area where it has been introduced, and it is outcompeting the native vegetation. So that is when it becomes invasive. So it's an organism that is not indigenous or native to a particular area, and it can cause great economic and environmental harm to the new area. So if it starts outcompeting the native vegetation and takes over the entire landscape, then it can actually cause a lot of economic and environmental harm. Some examples of invasive species in India: one of them is Lantana camara, which you might be aware of. It's very famous. Then there's Parthenium, which is also called Congress grass. There's Prosopis, and there are also some fish species like these catfish species called Clarius garipinus. Then there is Achatina filica, which is like a snail species. So it's not just plants which can be indigenous, there can be animal and fish species which can also in the end turn out to be indigenous and take over the entire habitat because they're better at utilizing the resources in this area. Now you might have already heard about lantana. Lantana is also called the wildfire because it spreads like wildfire. It takes over the entire habitat or the entire ecosystem, the entire landscape, and it's very good at utilizing resources much better than the native vegetation. So it threatens 40% of India's tiger habitat. So in this Mongabay study, you see that it has been found out that lantana invasion is actually threatening the vegetation of 40% of India's tiger reserves. And this example of Lantana camara, here you can see in this image. So the climates that are suitable for invasion of Lantana camara in India, it's highly suitable. The entirety of the country, the climate is highly suitable for Lantana to spread. And what has happened is it has actually spread and has taken a lot of these Indian landscapes. You can see a lot of the Western Ghats has been invaded by Lantana, and a lot of these central Indian forests as well have been highly invaded by lantana. So, approximately 44% of Indian forests, including 40% tiger habitats and 13.2 million hectares of pasture land. So, a lot of pasture land has also gotten covered by lantana. And why is lantana spreading so fast? Like, what is it that this plant has that our native vegetation lacks? So basically, lantana is toxic to herbivores. It's basically inedible. It contains certain chemical compounds which makes it inedible, and it's avoided by the local herbivores. So they don't feed on this plant. So first of all, the predation factor is gone. There's nothing controlling the growth of this plant because there's nothing eating this plant. So the herbivores are not feeding on the stems or the leaves, so it spreads. It is not controlled. Second thing is it secretes certain chemicals that can halt the growth of neighboring plants. So if there's a lantana growing somewhere, it will secrete these chemicals into the ground, which will make it difficult or impossible for the neighboring plants to grow, for the native vegetation to grow there. So that's another way that it kicks out the nature vegetation and it establishes in that area. And another important fact is that the berries of this. So why was lantana brought to India? Is because it has pretty flowers. So they wanted to have lantana in their gardens in India. Also, the berries of this plant are very sweet. So it attracts a lot of birds, a lot of frugivores, and the seeds are hardy. So if the birds and frugivores feed on these berries, the seeds actually pass through their gut and they get deposited in their feces. So along with the bird droppings, wherever the bird flies, the seeds get dropped, and because they're hardy, they eventually sprout into new lantana plants. So that's how lantana is spreading and doing way better than the native vegetation in the area. So there's no control because no herbivores feed on it. It is halting the growth of other plants nearby, so it can use a lot more area, and there's a lot of seed dispersal happening. So how India has a lot of lantana controlling projects going on, because it has been a huge, what do you call it, problem for Indian forests. So the government and NGOs have come up with a lot of ways to control lantana and are putting lantana to other uses. So one of them is this Elephant Family and Shola Trust, which is trying to eradicate lantana from the Nilgiris. So what they do is they make these huge elephant structures from lantana. So they actually take out the stems of lantana, they boil them and they make them malleable in such a way that they're actually making these huge elephants. And now even different animals, they're even making gores out of these lantana plants, and they're trying to spread awareness about this. So this initiative uses lantana stems to create life-size elephant sculptures for international exhibitions, and they raise funds for conservation and they provide employment. So they sell these elephants and gores, these huge structures, and they are trying to raise. So this is giving employment to the local people and the tribes there, and it's also they're also using it to conserve the forests and spread awareness about lantana. There's another thing, the Bandipur tiger, in which is happening in Bandipur Tiger Reserve in Karnataka. Basically, here, a major project which is involving the Zilla Panchayat and the Forest Department, they train the tribal women in the area in self-help groups, and they train them to create furniture. You can see here there's furniture and stools created out of lantana. So they make furniture out of lantana and baskets out of lantana, and they're sort of trying to create a sustainable livelihood for people, and they're trying to again spread awareness that this plant needs to be eradicated from the area. Another is this Erode district in Tamil Nadu, where there's another project happening in which lantana is converted into fuel briquettes for industries, and the tribal groups here are trained to produce handicrafts. Again, here also in Tamil Nadu, furniture is being made out of lantana stems. So they're trying to cut up as much lantana as possible to create these handicrafts or these different furnitures so that it can be used, put to economical use, and they can make money out of this lantana. And one of the methods which is supported to cut up lantana so that it does not grow again is the cut root stock method. This method is highly effective for removing the plant while so that it does not grow up again. So what was discovered is the forest department or the Indian government tried to take out lantana by a lot of different methods. One was this: they burnt the entire lantana plants, but they saw that it again sprouts even if you burn the plant. So that is not useful. Then they tried cutting down the plant. So if you cut out the stems of the plant, it still grows back again. It still sprouts again. And the third thing they tried was to actually, on a large scale, use JCBs to pull out the lantana plants, but that is also not helpful. What is happening there is that even if JCB is uprooting the plant from the ground, but there are a lot of seeds of lantana plants which stay in the ground. Even if you uproot it, there is a lot of seeds, dormant seeds, which lie in the floor underneath. And when you actually plow and these seeds get air and they get exposed to sunlight, they get exposed to water, they actually sprout again. So even if you use JCBs or you cut them by hand or you spread fire, you cannot eradicate lantana. So the a scientist's supported method is the cut rootstock method, which is thought to be highly effective. In which what they're doing is they're actually cutting the plant from. So they make a brief cut underground in the plant, and so that only the root system of the plant stays underground, but the entire shoot system has been taken out. And this root system is thought, or it's found that it does not sprout again, and they're trying to disturb the soil nearby in a minimal fashion, like as less as possible, trying to disturb the soil so that the dormant seeds don't sprout, and so that the natural vegetation can recover, because the soil is not disturbed. So the natural vegetation near this plant can actually sprout up. And it's found that from this, just the root structure or just the horizontal roots, lantana does not come up. So that is why they're sort of creating this cut root stock method. So they dig a little bit, and under the ground they make a cut which is 9 to 12 inches in size, so that it does not grow back again. Okay, so this was all about invasive species. Now talking about human impact on forests. So this we studied in an earlier slide as well in week 2. What is the human impact on forest? It's measured by this equation called I is equal to P into A into T, where I is the impact that we are having, P is the population size that that particular area is supporting of humans. A is the affluence or the consumption that is happening in that area per person. And T is technology, how much technology we have to extract the resources. So, what is happening right now is that, so for example, we always talk about increasing the GDP of the country. We should have higher GDP and this and that. And one way of measuring GDP, for example, is how much electricity is used per person, how much resources are being used per person. So if you're trying to increase GDP, you're actually trying to increase how much electricity is being used per person in a country, which means you're trying to increase consumption per person, which is actually quite unsustainable. But that is what is going on in the world right now. Everybody's talk about improving the GDP of your country. India's GDP is going down. We need to um, bring it back up again, this and that. So we're actually promoting the use of more and more resources per capita per person in our country. So that is how the impact on the forest is also increasing, because we keep on increasing A, and population size is anyway going up. Technology is also getting better and better with time. So that basically leads to more and more environmental impact. Next thing is to talk about island biogeography. So, another concept which was discussed this week was of island biogeography. Why was this discussed? Is because it tells you what is the rate of, or what is the species composition, and what is the rate of species extinction in a particular area. So, is anybody aware of the theory of island biogeography? Does anybody know what is island biogeography? Here is an image which can give you a little bit idea of what we're going to be talking about. But does anybody already know what is island biogeography? Okay, so if not, so basically, island biogeography is a theory which which was put forth by MacArthur and Wilson in the 1960s, and it talks about how much species richness is there on an island, and which is based on the migration rate or the immigration rate into the island, or the colonization of species in that island, size of the island, and extinction rate. So how fast are the species reaching the island, what is the size of the island, and what is the extinction rate. So there are two things. Here you can see there are two factors which are affecting these colonization rate and extinction rate, colonization or immigration, whatever. So one thing is that how far is the island from the mainland. So distance. So what do you think, if an island, which island will have more immigration out of these four, A, C, B, D? Which of these islands will have more immigration onto the island compared to the other ones? So, what do you think? From logical thinking, which of these islands will have more migration of animals or species from the mainland to the island? A, B, C, or D? It can have multiple answers as well. Anyone? So, I'm just going a little bit into island biogeography. It was not really discussed in detail in this week, but to give you like a little bit of extra knowledge, maybe D. Yeah. Why do you think so? Why do you think D would have more immigration or more species coming into compared to A, B, or C? So here in this image, as you can see, there are two factors happening. The distance is less and the area is bigger. Correct. So there are two things that are important for island biogeography: is how far is the island and how big is the island. So, but the rate of immigration doesn't really matter on how big is the island. So D and B both will have similar rates of immigration because they are similar distances from the mainland. So the rate of immigration will be higher in the islands which are closer to the mainland. So distance is one aspect that plays a role in what is the species richness on an island. Okay, so the islands which are closer to the mainland will have more immigration coming, more species coming in from the mainland compared to the islands which are further away. Second thing is area of the island. So if an island is bigger than the other, then it can support more species, either because it has a diversity of habitats in that island, or because it can support more population sizes, greater population sizes, right? So in that case, C and D can actually support more species compared to A and B, right? So these two factors play an important role in understanding what can be a species richness in an island. So it's a very basic theory. If an island is closer to the mainland, it will have more immigration, um, compared to the islands which are further away from the mainland. And if an island is bigger in size, then it will have lower extinction rates than the islands which are smaller, because the bigger islands can sustain more species. Because of the mere reason that their size is bigger, the resources will be higher in those areas, right? Now, this graph, which might look a little intimidating or complex at first, but let me walk you through it. So what is happening here is, on the x-axis we're talking about what is the number of species on the island, and on the y-axis we're basically talking about the rate of colonization and the rate of extinction. So in yellow we're talking about colonization, in green we're talking about extinction. So if you have so when you're talking about immigration, as we discussed, the immigration rates will be higher in an island which is closer to the mainland compared to the island which is far away from the mainland. So here you see, in island which is closer to the mainland, more immigration is happening, more colonization is happening compared to an island which is far away from the mainland. And extinction, as I just said, will be lower in an island which is larger in size, and will be higher in an island which is lower in size, which is smaller in size, right? So rate of extinction is goes higher as the island size decreases, and rate of colonization goes higher as the island is closer to the mainland. And here these points A, B, C, D are points of equilibrium, where actually the rate of extinction and the rate of colonization become the same. So here, you will find that this is the number of species that you found in that. This is the number of species that you found on that particular island. If it is this far and this much in size, so wherever the rate of colonization and the rate of extinction become equal, that is the number of species you will find in that island. Okay, so that was a little bit about island biogeography. And this will come handy when we're trying to estimate the species loss. So, what island biogeography says is that if S is the species richness of an island, then it will be given by this formula, C into A to the power Z. C into A to the power Z, where A is the area of the island and Z and C are constants depending on the species composition of that particular area. Now, why are we talking about island biogeography when we're talking about forests and species? So, these days, mostly, as you might already be aware, forests can also be thought of as islands, because there's usually a forest area, and around that, you have a lot of human occupied area. You'll either have roads running around, you have highways, or you have villages. So, these forests are not really connected, they're not really contiguous patches through of land. They're small islands which are interspersed by human occupied land. If you had a connectivity through the forests, that would have been a different deal. But right now, because there's very little connectivity between forests, they can more or less be thought of as islands, because species cannot move across these different islands. So that is why when we talk about estimating the rate of species loss, you can actually use this island biogeography wala equation, where S, or the species richness, depends upon the area raised to the power of Z, which is a constant which depends on the species composition. Now, what has been found is that Z mostly varies between the values of 0.15 and 0.35. Okay, now to walk you through how to estimate species loss, for example, assume that you have Z as zero point 0.3 and you have an area, say A1. So now if you calculate the species richness of this area, it will be S1 is equal to C into A1 to the power zero point 0.3. Now, for example, say you have either locked the forest or something happened that the area has been reduced to A2, which is A1 by 10, which is 1/10 of the previous area. So, for example, logging of the forest happened and the forest has been destroyed, and you're only left with 10% of the area. So, A2 is zero point 0.1 into A1. Now what you see is S2, which is the new species richness, it will be C into zero point 0.1 of A1 to the power zero point 0.3. Now if you compare S1 and S2, you will see that S2 by S1, it will come out to be 1 by 10 to the power zero point 0.3, which is basically more or less comes out to be 50% of S1. Okay, so now even if you have destroyed 90% of the forest patch, you're only left with 10% area, you still see that species richness only goes down by 50%. So this gives you a little hope that, okay, fine, even if a lot of forest is destroyed, the species richness is still more or less intact. But based on the current rates of forest loss, we actually see that if you're losing a lot of forest land with the actual rate of forest areas that we're losing, tropical forests that we're losing, we actually see that we're losing around 27,000 species per year, which is a very high number. So even if you take the lowest z value, which is of 0.15, or say you're taking a value of zero point 0.2, even if you calculate by that, you will see that a lot of species are being lost right now, and that is why it calls for some intervention, some type of protection of the forests. Okay, but this is how you estimate species loss. So if you're given some numerical based on this, this is how you'll go about it. Now, when talking about extinction, what do you think makes a species more susceptible to extinction? So, can you guys think about some factors that might make a species more susceptible to extinction? Can you think about a factor that might make a species more prone to extinction? Anyone? You can just take a guess. What do you think can cause a species to go extinct? Competition. Okay. So if there's competition between multiple species, and then you say one of them is completely uh, taken over by the other species, then that can lead to extinction of that species, right? Limited food sources, yeah. If the resources are limited, that can cause a species to go extinct. So yeah, you guys are correct. These are also some natural causes that can cause a species to go extinct. Other broader reasons can be if a species is rare, then it has more chances of going extinct. Habitat loss, yes. So basically, habitat loss comes under the um umbrella of limited resources, because habitat is also a resource that is the space that a species is using. So space is also one form of a resource. So the more rare a species is, the more chances of it getting extinct, the more susceptible it is to extinction. And what are some reasons that the species could be rare? So there could be a restriction to an uncommon habitat. Maybe that species is found in a very uncommon kind of an habitat. For example, it's only found in some desert springs, it's found in only some oases. So that species is in a very uncommon habitat. So the habitat is uncommon, which makes the species also very uncommon in itself, because it cannot be found everywhere else. So it's restricted to that particular area. Other thing could be it has a very limited geographical range. So, for example, like we talk about endemic species, for example, some species are only found in the Western Ghats and they're not found anywhere outside of the Western Ghats. Then that's, in a global sense, that's very limited geographic range. For example, most of the Australian species, which are only found in Australia, which is one island, um, when you think about it from a global perspective, if something were to happen to Australia, all of those species are in danger of extinction. So yeah, so as you said, habitat loss, if their geographic range is so limited, if anything happens to the habitat, if the habitat is lost, then that species is also lost. For example, say there's one species that is found in one particular, in certain lakes in certain tropical forests, and now something happens because of climate change, there is no rain happening, say for example in that area, and that lake, a lot of the water evaporates. So now if the species loses its habitat, it loses the water in the lake, then that species of fish will also go extinct, right? Because it's it's found only in that particular lake, nowhere outside. So that leads to another reason, which is maybe it has a very limited geographical range. And then last reason is a low population density. For example, these big species like polar bears or pandas, they have like low population density per area because they have huge home ranges. So if they have a huge home range, so they cannot sustain high populations in a small area. And because humans have been destroying forests or have been destroying natural areas to occupy more and more of these natural areas, these particular species don't get a lot of the land to themselves. And because they're in direct competition with humans, which can take over much of the area, that leads to another reason, which can cause their extinction. So the more rare a species is, the more chances of it getting extinct. And reasons for rarity can be because it lives in an uncommon habitat and not anywhere else. It has a limited geographical range, or it has a very low population density. Okay. And there could be different reasons for why a species is sensitive to the impact of humans, like why a particular species is very sensitive to human impact. One could be adaptability or resilience of the species. Not every species is as resilient to the changes that we're exposing them to. For example, if you're talking about birds, so say there is logging of forest happening, and now there's not as much tree density in that area. Say a lot of the land got logged off, and you only have certain areas which have dense forest and the others are like logged forests. So what you see is, when you look at the bird composition in that area, you'll see that not all of the species are able to occupy the logged forests, because certain species will be occupying certain specific niches uh, in the undisturbed forest, in the unlogged forests. And these niches would not get translated into the logged forest because you have destroyed those trees. So species will not be able to come out of the undestructed forest. They will not be able to occupy the logged forests. So uh, they're more sensitive to human change. But there will be certain other species which will be able to explore this logged forest as well, because they are, say, more generalistic compared to these species. So they will be hardy enough and they will be resilient to the change that is caused by humans, right? Then there is human attention. Certain species get a lot more human attention. For example, these charismatic species like elephants, tigers, leopards, whose hides or whose ivory tooth, all of these are being collected by humans. So if they're receiving, or porcupines, if they're receiving much more attention by humans, or humans are very interested in hunting them or getting them somehow, then they will be more sensitive to human impact, because they're getting a lot more attention and they're being like poached or something by humans. They have a lot more ecological overlap with humans. For example, I told you, like, there are these big species. For example, say there are elephants which want to wander around the areas, but because between two particular forest patches there's a lot of fields, there's a lot of human occupied areas, they'll end up disturbing the humans living in those village areas. And humans, in response, will try and either kill the elephant, or they'll try and drive it away. So, because there's a lot of ecological overlap happening there in space with humans, eventually humans will win, as we all know, and the species will get affected by that, right? Then, home range requirement of the species, similar thing. If the home range of the species, if the species needs a lot more home range than is available to it, it'll be more sensitive to changes, because as we know, humans have been cutting and cutting down the forest into smaller and smaller chunks. So if the species does not have a proper home range, it will not be able to sustain itself. So there is this acronym HIPPO, which was again given by E.O. Wilson. It talks about what are the different threats to biodiversity. So does anybody here know what does HIPPO stand in HIPPO, which is basically an acronym which is used to talk about threats to biodiversity? Is anybody aware about this acronym? Okay, so this acronym HIPPO actually stands for habitat destruction, or as you said, habitat loss, invasive species, this pollution. There is population growth and there is over harvesting. So there are these five causes which can be threats to biodiversity, which are uh, given by the acronym HIPPO, which is easier to remember. There is habitat destruction. So if the habitat is destroyed, it can actually affect the biodiversity of that area. If there's a lot of invasive species, then they will take over the native, they will outcompete the native species and occupy the land. If there's a lot of pollution, that's going to degrade the habitat and again, kind of going to lead to habitat destruction. A lot of population growth of humans means humans need more space now, need more resources. So that's going to reduce the amount of resources available to the biodiversity, other species out there, and over harvesting. If I mean, you would be aware of what is over harvesting, but mostly if you are taking out more resources than the environment has the power to regenerate, then that's over harvesting. For example, an area has say a certain number of for example, there's a lake and there are people that fish in that lake. So if the lake has like a certain number of fish, for example, there are some 5,000 fish in that lake, and if they breed, they can actually double their number. Just assume that they can double their number. So for example, humans go and in 1 year they take out say 2,000 of those fishes. So now there are 3,000 left, right? So in 1 year you took out 2,000 fishes from that lake. Out of 5,000, there's 3,000 fishes left. And because they can double in 1 year, so next year there's 6,000, and you can take 2,000 or 3,000, and then next year there'll be 6,000 again, and then you can take. So this is taking out an okay amount of fishes. But for example, what over harvesting would mean is if you're taking out of 5,000, you're taking out 4,000 fishes. There's only 1,000 left. They can become 2,000. Now, because there's just 2,000, you're still capturing more and more. So, for example, you took 1,500. There's 500 left. It can only become 1,000. And then in the end, you'll somehow end up taking out, say, 900. Only 10 fishes left. This will lead to eventually, it will be a threat to that fish, and eventually it'll go extinct in that area because there's not much fish left. So that's over harvesting, taking out more resources than nature has the power to regenerate. This can happen in the case of fishes, animals, plants, anything. So for example, poaching also is the same thing, right? If they are killing off, as we talked about in the previous weeks, if they're killing off, say, if you're talking about tiger population, and if the hunting was controlled, if you're talking about game birds, if the hunting was controlled, then they could actually repopulate and sustain their numbers. But because humans take carry out an unregulated amount of hunting, they over harvest that particular species. That is why it's unable to sustain itself. So yeah, that was all about the threats to biodiversity. Now, what are some factors that can actually lead to extinction of a species? So these factors can be of two types. One could be a deterministic factors, and the second type is actually the stochastic factors, which can actually lead to extinction of a particular species. So what happens in deterministic factors are, these are the factors that mostly affect populations of bigger sizes. So if you have a population of a good size, of a proper size, uh, then mostly deterministic factors affect that population. Three deterministic factors are birth rate, death rate, and population age structure. So how birth and death rate affects the population size or extinction of the population is, for example, if a population, there's a birth rate, then there's a death rate. If the birth rate is greater than death rate or it's equal to death rate, then you say that if it's more than death rate, then you say that the population is flourishing because there's more progeny than the organisms, the number of organisms that are dying out. If the birth rate is equal to death rate, then you say that the population is maintaining itself, it's sustaining at a good level because there's an equilibrium in the birth and death rate. If you say if the death rate now overpowers the birth rate, then the population will start declining, the numbers will start declining because there's more deaths happening than births. So there's always be more deaths than births, and the population will start declining. What about population age structure? So what happens in age structure is that if you have more older organisms, more older individuals compared to the younger ones, eventually it will lead to a decline in the population because if there's always more older individuals than younger ones, then it will not be able to have more progeny. The progeny will also be lesser in number in turn. So it will lead to, again, it will be a declining population. Then coming to this graph here, you might already know, be aware of this graph. So when you look at
time in sense of number of generations or time, and there's population size. So mostly what happens is, there is a lag phase in which the population numbers are starting to rise. Then eventually this goes into a log phase where this population numbers, these individuals start multiplying faster and faster, and that's the log phase. There's a sudden spike in the population, but eventually, because of limitation in resources, it'll start to plateau. So it'll start to reach a steady state, which is the carrying capacity of that area, which is the number of individuals in the population that the area can sustain based on the amount of resources present in that area. So above this, it cannot sustain. That's why there's this like undulating or this sigmoid, sinusoidal kind of a thing happening here, because sometimes the population numbers will overshoot, but because of limitation in resources, there'll deaths happen. It'll come down and then it'll go up again. So it'll keep going around this carrying capacity, but it'll not be able to overshoot that unless more resources are added into the area. Okay, so based on the resources, this is mostly what happens in most of the populations. There'll be a lag phase in which it's slowly the numbers are rising. Then there's a log phase, there's a huge spike in the numbers. So this is the kind of growth that is happening when a new species get introduced in a particular area. So if it's a new species, the numbers are low, and it eventually establishes itself, and the numbers rise suddenly, and then it reaches a stable state. Okay, so these are deterministic factors which by which you can see how the population is, what are the population dynamics in that area. Now, there are certain other factors which are called stochastic factors or chance factors, which are mostly at play in smaller population sizes and not in like these bigger populations. And that is having different sex ratios. Say, if there are more males than females, then of course this population is not going to have more progeny, because the number of progeny is always limited by the number of females, because females are the ones which are going to be giving birth. So if you have more males than females, that's going to affect the population sizes. If there's a sudden catastrophe, so if there was a small population, say, living in a particular forest area, and it's nowhere outside, and a sudden catastrophe happens, for example a sudden forest fire happens and that forest is destroyed, then that population is also destroyed. It's gone extinct because it's not found anywhere else, because it's a small population. So the entire population gets extinct because of the catastrophe. Then say there is genetic drift. So in smaller populations, if any of you have studied genetics, they might know. And in smaller populations, there can be a genetic drift. For example, there's certain two alleles there, and because it's a small population, suddenly one of the two alleles takes over, and if that allele is actually harmful, or it's a mutation that leads to more and more death, it can actually lead to a decrease in the population sizes. And because of this genetic drift, it can also cause some inbreeding depression. Then there's migration. Say suddenly most of this individuals out of this population in this population start migrating out, then again this population will not be able to sustain itself, because most of the individuals have just migrated out. So there are certain more factors that come under stochastic, but these are some to give you an idea of what is stochastic factors that affect a population dynamics, right? So these are factors leading to extinction. Next lecture. So these were mostly threats. The previous lecture was mostly about threats to the forest, where we talked about what are the different natural threats, what are different man-made threats, and how which species are more exposed to extinction. What are the different you know loss of biodiversity, how that happens, and all of that. Next fact chapter is about forest fires, and this is called the fire triangle, in which all these things need to be present for a fire to spread. One of them is oxygen, as you might already be aware that you need oxygen for something to burn. Then you need a fuel. If there's no fuel, there's going to be no fire. And there needs to be heat, which is generated out of that fire. So this is the fire triangle: oxygen, heat, and fuel. All of these three are, if they are present, is when a forest or is when a fire will spread. So, talking about forest fires, so what really is a forest fire? What comprises a forest fire? So, generally uncontrolled fire in an area which might contain combustible vegetation in forests. So, usually a forest fire is uncontrolled, because if it keeps spreading is when it's called a forest fire. If it's controlled, then of course you've taken care of the fire, which is a good thing. But more or less it's uncontrolled fire which is spreading through an area in the forest which comprises of combustible vegetation. You might think, how is vegetation combustible, or how is things catching on fire? But mostly if you have an area with a very dry climate, and there's a lot of leaf litter, for example, on the ground, and there's a lot of grasses which have dried out because the this time of the year it's dry, it's winter, there's no rainfall happening, and there's a lot of sun. Then these things can catch on fire, and eventually the trees can also catch on fire in these areas because there's not a lot of water present in the environment. What are different causes of forest fires? So the causes of forest fires can again be natural or man-made. So can anybody here list out some natural causes of forest fires? Anything that comes in mind? What could be some natural causes of forest fires? Lightning, yes. So lightning is a cause of spreading forest fires. So what happens is it happens if it's not accompanied by rainfall. And if in a zone there's sudden lightning and there's a lot of dry, as I said, leaf litter or grasses, or the environment in general is dry, this some spark out of the lightning can actually lead to a forest fire. Anything else? Yeah, so you have gone through the lecture. Rubbing of stones, dry bamboo. Yeah, all of these. Some human activities will actually come under a human cause of forest fire and will not be a natural non-anthropogenic cause. So causes of forest fires can be natural or anthropogenic. In natural, as you said, there can be lightning, there can be volcanic eruptions in the area which can lead to forest fires in the neighboring forests, rubbing of dry bamboo or friction of rolling stones. So rubbing of dry bamboos, usually bamboo in the dry season becomes combustible, and if because of wind two dry bamboo plants are rubbing against each other, they can actually lead to friction and fire after that. And friction in rolling stones, if again in the dry season there are certain stones which are rubbing against each other because of the wind or certain activity, or as we know in certain areas it's actually the birds that are setting fires to certain zones of the forests. So what is happening in those areas is that birds are aware, or like not aware, but fine, so birds, what they do is they will actually on purpose start throwing stones from the sky while flying so that they hit the stones down. So, on purpose, they will throw the stones down so that they clash with another stone, which will lead to some sparking. And with this sparking, certain areas of the forest will catch fire, or say some grasses catch fire. Because of this fire, the insects will start flying, and these insects can then easily be caught by these birds as food. So, sometimes the birds actually lead to forest fires, which has been found in certain studies, which is very interesting in my opinion. Then there are certain anthropogenic causes of fires. How can human leads to forest fires? So some very basic causes. It can be either deliberately setting a forest on fire, or it can be accidentally setting a forest on fire. Deliberately, what is happening is it could be shifting cultivation. You might already be aware of jhol cultivation, um, where what people used to do is they used to cultivate one section of the forest, and then they'll move on to the next section. When this land has become infertile and they cannot cultivate anymore, they will leave it fallow so that it can regain its resources and nutrients over time, and they'll move on to the next section of the forest where they'll cut down the trees and they will set fire. And because these trees um, they contain a lot, the biomass contains a lot of nutrients, like we know from nutrient cycling that a lot of these nutrients get stored into the trees. When you burn down the vegetation, it will add the nutrients back to the soil, and when you cultivate this area which contains the ash of the trees that you've just burnt, this area will be fertile because the ash will contain nutrients from the biomass, that from the nutrients that were stored in the trees, so which can be taken up by the crop. So that is shifting cultivation. And that's how it was done in the in like earlier times, where they used to carry out this jhol cultivation, shifting cultivation. They'll move across these lands, and by the time they have cultivated say 2 3 plots, the first plot which they had left fallow will regain its fertility, and they will now burn this area, and the other ones can actually uh, regenerate in that much time. Flushing growth of tendu leaves. So tendu leaves are actually used for making BDs. And what is flushing growth is actually they set fire to certain to certain plants of tendu leaves so that new leaves can come up on these plants, which are actually good quality for making BDs. So they are deliberately setting fire to these plants again. Next is to have a good growth of grasses. If you burn the old grasses, now you will have fresh, good growth of grasses. Out of rivalry, so people set fire to other people's forest land, or they set fire to forests if they have a rivalry either with the forest department, or they can set land to personal forests because they have a rivalry with other people, something like that. For encroachment, as I said, if there are people who have fields near the forest areas, they can actually burn down certain zone of the forest and start encroaching and cultivating there. So yeah, that's how for encroachment people set fire. For either they're trying to clear the forest areas for road construction, so in that matter also they might set fire to the forest. For concealing illicit felling or hunting, so for example, there's a area where there was illegal felling of trees or hunting happened, and maybe the forest guard is trying to conceal it, or people there are trying to hide it, then they can set fire to that area and they can just say that, oh, there was a forest fire here, so nobody will know that certain trees have been felled or animals have been hunted in that area. Or it could be customary, basically uh, it's something that is religiously or as a custom carried out by the local tribes in that area. So that's a deliberate uh, cause of fire, but that's usually to a very small area of the forest and not like to the entire forest. Then these could be some accidental causes. Accidentally, what could happen is, as you might all be aware, that a lot of people carry out burning of crop residues. So when you cut down all the crops by using say a big harvester, then there's certain stubble which is left behind. There's small stubble of the crop which is left behind, which is very difficult to actually take out by hand, and it's time consuming. So what farmers these days do is they just set the fields to fire. And sometimes this fire by wind can actually go closer and closer to the forests nearby, which can actually lead to a forest fire. So the farmer was not actually trying to set fire to the forest, but the forest got burnt down as a byproduct of burning the crop residues. People could actually be setting up fires to drive away wild animals. So if the wild animals, they try and come closer and closer to the villages, people try and drive them away by fire, and this can actually lead to accidental burning of the forests. Somebody who might be have gone to the forest to carry out certain say collecting some forest produce, through a lighted BD in the forest, could lead to a forest fire um, if that time of the year is dry and heat is high. Campfires gone wrong. A lot of tourists, a lot of people get into the forest and they're trying to set up a campfire, bonfire, enjoy their good time. But sometimes this can go wrong. It can get uncontrolled, out of hand, and can lead to a forest fire. Then there could be prescribed burning gone wrong. A lot of the times forest officers are actually carrying out prescribed burning, like on purpose they're burning certain areas of the forest which can be good for the forest itself, but this could go wrong and can lead to a full blown forest fire itself. Charcoal making, so when people are making charcoal, what they do is they cut down timber, they stuff it up into pots, in and they cover it up, and they put this on fire, like they put a flame under that pot. So what is happening is they are anaerobically trying to burn the timber inside, uh, which is thought of, or which basically gives you good quality charcoal, which gives you cleaner charcoal in that manner if it's burning without any oxygen supply. So when they're making this charcoal, they're usually just trying to set like a fire under that container which is contains the timber. But this fire can actually spread if it's being carried out near the forest areas, and then it can lead to a fire. If they're melting coal tar, if they're basically constructing roads through or highways through lands, and they're melting coal tar to uh, for the road construction, but while melting it, while setting up this fire, it can spread to the nearby forests, and that is again an accidental cause of forest. Or if there are some sparks happening in transformers or vehicles, this can be other anthropogenic causes of fires, but accidental. They're not trying to burn the forest, but it happened because they were doing something else. Okay, so these were certain natural and man made causes for forest fires. But there are different types of forest fires. So, is anybody aware of what are the different types of forest fires? Uh, And like, yeah, how are forest fires classified? So there are different ways in which you can classify forest fires based on where the fire is actually happening. Yeah, very good. So there's ground, surface, ground fire, and there's one more thing. There are ladder fires and there are firestorms. So ground fires are actually fires that are happening mostly underground. They're not even happening on the surface. So something that gives away a ground fire is that you'll start feeling that the ground is getting more and more is getting warmer. But mostly ground fires go uncontrolled because they are concealed, and you'll only get to know about the ground fire when it comes to the surface. And how ground fire happens is that more of these tubers or these roots which are dry, if they catch fire somehow, for example, one of these accidental human reasons, they catch fire somehow underground, the fire will keep spreading underground through dry roots and tubers, and only when it reaches the surface will it get detected by us. Second is the surface fire, basically a fire happening at the forest ground level or in the surface level. Either the leaf litter has caught fire, or yeah, mostly dry leaf litter, which is say leaves are being shed by the trees, and in sunlight they mostly get dried up and there's no water present. So if these leaf litters catch fire, then that's a surface fire. Ladder fire, if there's a lot of climbers, uh, there's a lot of climbers onto the trees which may get dried with season. So these climbers actually take the surface fires towards the canopy. So these dry climbers can catch fire and they can take this fire towards the canopy. So there's the canopy or the crown fire where the top of the trees are burning. And this is the fire which spreads very fast because the trees, basically the canopy is connected, as we all know. And because of connected canopy, the fire will spread very fast through the canopy of the trees. And then there's a firestorm and uncontrolled. So all of these can be uncontrolled. But in a firestorm, what is happening is the fire is able to sustain itself. So basically, in a firestorm, there's an area of the forest which catches fire and it creates a wind system of its own. So where the fire is going on, the air there will get the pressure will get low, the air will get hot, it will expand and rise up, and this will create a low pressure area, and from sides the colder air will come into this area. So there's a wind system which is being sustained by the fire itself, and because fresh air is coming from the sides, cooler air, it carries more oxygen with it, and it again it feeds into the fire. So there's a positive feedback system here. The fire is causing the wind and the wind is feeding into the fire. So that's a firestorm, right? Here you can see basically surface fire, ground fire, which is happening in the canopy, and ground fire, which is actually happening even under the surface and it goes undetected. Again, ground fire, you can see there is smoke coming out from the ground, but there's no fire that you can see on the surface here. Surface fire, you can actually see fire on the forest floor, and ground fire, the fire is happening now at the tree level on the canopy, right? Now, there are different impacts that a forest fire can have. So, can anybody tell me certain basic impacts that a forest fire can have? Like, what are some basic things that come to your mind that, okay, this forest is now on fire? So, what impacts can a forest fire have? It can affect regeneration, yeah. So, basically, if a particular area was actually in undergoing ecological succession, and if it now a forest fire has spread in that area, it can affect uh, the stage of ecological succession it was at, and it will actually affect the regeneration of that area. Anything else? Yeah, biodiversity loss. So of course, if there's a forest which has caught on fire, the animals, the species, the plant species in that area all have been burnt down. So there's a huge loss of biodiversity in that area. Anything else? Ecosystem gets destroyed, yeah. So basically that entire habitat itself will get destroyed if the fire is of a bigger extent, right? So this forest fire will also alter soil development and nutrient circulation. Yeah, air pollution will also happen because there's a huge amount of area which is on fire, so a lot of carbon dioxide will get released into the atmosphere. So yeah, very good. Certain impacts of forest fires, one of them is that it can affect the soil development, like what stage is the soil at. Also, because there are nutrients that are trapped in the soil, as we are aware, if there's a forest fire happening, it can affect these nutrients and whatever stage the soil is at, and it can lead to a lot of drying of the soil and a lot of nutrient loss from the soil. So the circulation itself, the cycle itself, will be affected. There's increased erosion and silting of resources now because there are no trees which are holding the soil together at this point. There's a lot of erosion of soil from that area, and these resources can get silted also very fast from that area. The rate of evaporation and transpiration get affected because now the area has been burnt down. So obviously there'll be more rate of higher rate of evaporation, higher rate of transpiration, because there's a lot of barren area. So there's no, like, the heat is high in that area, and there's not a lot of vegetation cover to prevent evaporation from happening. Loss of biodiversity, as you mentioned, because the entire area has been burnt down, so of course a lot of animals and plants are affected. Natural succession or regeneration is affected. Species composition distribution, it basically comes out of biodiversity. If the biodiversity is lost, the species composition of the area also gets affected, and species try and run away from the area, so distribution also gets affected from that area. And there's an altered pattern of resource availability for animals. As we said, now a lot of plants have been burnt down, a lot of you know soil resources are destroyed, so it will also alter how these resources are available to animals. Also, how, if habitat itself is considered as an area and now the habitat is destroyed, how the animals will be able to use this habitat. For example, certain species were living on trees, but now the trees, for example, there are birds, and if there's a forest fire, the birds flew away because they flew out of the forest because they're like, okay, the forest is on fire. But now they can't even come back to that area because the trees are destroyed. So what trees that they used, their habitat is destroyed, so the resource is no longer available. And there's large amount of carbon dioxide release, so large amount of pollution. And there's loss of livelihoods, in the sense that if there was ecotourism happening to that area, there were people which were using that forest as livelihoods, they were collecting forest produce or something else. Now they lose their livelihoods because there's no more ecotourism gonna happen for some while till that forest gets regenerated, right? So a lot of impacts of forest fire that affect the forest, they affect the biodiversity, and even us or the people living near the forest areas or using forests as a resource for their livelihoods. Then there are different management strategies that you can have to prevent forest fires or to handle forest fires, right? So, what are these management strategies? First of all, as I said, there should be some prevention. You can think about strategies how you can prevent the forest fire from happening. Monitoring and reporting, forest department should come up with ways so that they're able to always keep a check of the forests, and as soon as a forest fire happens, they're able to detect it as soon as possible and to report it to the higher ups or report it to the concerned authority so that they can take an action. They can start firefighting. There should be some sort of ways in which they're able to handle the fire better, and they're more equipped to take control of these forest fires. Some way that they can rehabilitate the forest, they're able to, like, get things back on track, they're able to regenerate the forest. There might be requirement of artificial rehabilitation. The forest department might have to go and now plant new saplings into the area so that the forest rehabilitates faster. So that's another management strategy. And there could be, they could carry out community mobilization, they should carry out community mobilization and awareness, where the local people are made more aware about their actions so that they don't accidentally set forests on fires. And they're also, like, a way to tell them how dangerous forest fires can be for themselves and for the biodiversity, for the ecosystem in general. So there should be some sort of an awareness program that's being carried out. And also the people should be mobilized in a way that they can help the forest department out when there is a forest fire. So if and when there is a forest fire, they can also lend a helping hand to the department, right? So there could be these different management strategies. Preventing fires in the first place, if there is a fire, early detection and reporting, how to handle that fire that has already happened, how to rehabilitate a forest which has been burnt down, and making the community in that area aware of forest fires, and mobilizing them in a way that they can be helpful to the department, right? So these are the different management strategies. Now, what are fire lines? Fire lines basically are this zone between. So if there's a contiguous forest, there's a continuous stretch of forests. then if even if a small forest fire happen, it can spread throughout the forest. So what the forest department does is they create these zones, they broad strips of land which are cleared of any vegetation or cleared of all combustible fuel material. So they will either cut down the grasses and bring them towards the center, and they will set fire to that in a controlled manner so that there's no more fuel left in that area. So even if a fire is spreading, like you can see in the left of the image, a fire is spreading, it does not reach the forest. Okay, it does not reach the next section of the forest, so that at least that one is saved from burning down. Okay, so fire lines are sufficiently broad strips of land which are kept clean of all combustible material so that the fire cannot extend from one side to another. So if you have a huge forest, you can actually cut down or keep these strips of land free of any sort of combustible material by either bringing them to the center and then putting them on fire in a very controlled manner, so that now there is no more combustible material left. And these are called fire lines because they prevent fire from spreading from one side to the other. Okay, that's fire lines, but they're not always foolproof. They have their own caveats. One is bleeding of fire. Fire can spread from one side of the forest line to the next. It is possible. Why? Because there might be certain areas where there's still combustible material left, or the fire line was like not broad enough, or there was wind activity enough to spread it to the other side. So there can be bleeding of fire happening from one side to the other. There could be infiltration in the sense that you made a fire line, very good, between two sides. You made a fire line, and now there's no combustible material left. But even throughout the system, the trees will keep shedding dry leaves, and these dry leaves can blow and come towards your forest line, and then again there'll be fuel in your forest line. So now, even if a fire spreads, your fire line will not be able to stop it because there's new fuel being added to that particular area. So there's infiltration, there's repopulation. So maybe you cut down the grasses, you burnt them, and now there's no combustible material. But because you burnt the grasses, and there is now this ash which we said is fertile because it contains nutrients, new grasses can sprout in the area. And when new grasses sprout, eventually they will also dry up because the season is dry, and they will become the new fuel. So again, it gets repopulated and more fuel is added to the area. Or because of mosaic reasons, basically you were making a fire line but certain zones got left out. So people were making the fire line, but certain areas got left out. Certain, it became a patchy fire line, and it's not entirely uniformly burnt and it's not contiguous. That can lead to a patchy forest line, and fire can spread through these patches of combustible material between the two forest zones between which you were building the fire line. So these are certain caveats or certain um, problems with constructing forest fire lines. Another thing that the forest department has come up with are fire breakers. So these are certain structures which are constructed in the forest so as to prevent spread of fire from one zone to the other. Now these structures need to be such that they prevent the fire from spreading, but they should not be preventing or causing any disruption to wildlife movement. So you cannot build like a brick wall between the forest to prevent fire from spreading from this area to that area, because that will also disrupt the movement of animals, herbivores, or insects from one area to the other. So you need to make it such that the wildlife can still move. So what they came up with is to make these mud structures. So these mud structures which can prevent fire from spreading from one side to the other. And what they found is they made two kinds of structures. One was this cuboidal structure, one was this prism shaped prismoid structure to prevent fire from spreading. Both of them prevent fire from spreading from one side to the other. But the benefit with this prism or this triangular structure is that even if new leaf litter falls down, it will go down the edges of the sides and will not get deposited on top of the fire breaker itself. In this cuboidal structure, there might be more leaf litter falling from the trees, and it will get deposited at the top of the structure of the fire breaker, and the fire will still bleed from one side to the other. But that will not happen in the case of the triangular structure. So that one is much better than the cuboidal structure. So this is all about fire breakers, and this was all about forest fires. Now, the next lecture was about certain forest acts of the country, or yeah, certain acts which have been uh, made by law, certain forest laws which have been set up in order to protect our forests. So, the first one that was discussed was the Indian Forest Act, which was set up in 1927. So because we got independence in 1947, so basically this one was set up under the British colonial rule, and um it is still valid in our country. It's still being used. So the Indian Forest Act, why was it created? It was created in order to control forest resources, for example, timber and non-timber forest produce, regulate timber extraction, so how timber is getting extracted and what kind of a tax will be applied to that, to protect government forests, so certain areas which are deemed to be government forests, so this act is meant to protect those, and to generate revenue in some sort of a way, generate economic revenue out of the forest. So this is what this act was created for: control the forest resources, regulate timber extraction, protect government forests, and generate revenue. So something you can notice very easily is that there's no way in which they're talking about how to protect wildlife, how to protect biodiversity, loss of biodiversity, how to protect forest land. None of this comes under this act. So this was, at that point, they were not thinking about all of this. They were just thinking about how to control forest resources, how to regulate timber, and how to prevent, these resources to be illegally taken out, and to just keep them as government resources and to generate revenue out of forests. So that is what this act was for. And there are three types of forests that are distinguished under the Indian Forest Act. One are reserved forests. Basically, reserved forests have the highest level of protection, so people cannot just enter reserved forests. Public access is highly restricted, and activities like grazing, hunting, cutting of trees, they're completely banned unless otherwise permitted by the government. So you cannot like take your animals to graze, hunt there, or carry out any form of tree cutting in these areas. So these are entirely reserved forests for the government use. So they give maximum power to the government. Next one are protected forests. Protected forests are less strict than reserved forests. Some rights are allowed to the local people or to the tribes in that area, but still government can regulate the activities happening here. Last ones are village forests. They're mostly managed by the village communities, and the government can assign rights to the villagers. So government, so because they're village forests, government can assign rights to the villagers that okay, you can do this, you can do that, but only to this extent and not more than that. Okay. So there are these three types of forests in the IFA: reserved forest, highest level of protection; protected forest, a little bit less strict than the reserved forest; and village forest, mostly maintained by the villagers. Now, how do you settle that this is a forest area, or how is a reserve forest declared? So what happens is, before declaring a reserve forest, the government should conduct an inquiry in that area that okay, this land is not owned by anybody else, it's government land. So they need to conduct an inquiry in the area. They need to record what are the claims of the local people on that land or in that particular zone, how much claim do they have over that land, and they decide which of their rights will continue. Like, will the local people still be allowed to graze their cattle? Will they still be allowed to collect firewood from that area? Will they still be allowed to collect non-timber forest produce, which we were doing earlier, before they claim or before they declare a land to be a reserve forest? So all of this happens. Now, what are the powers with the government under this act? So what all powers does this act give to the government? There are very strong powers given to the forest officers. They can declare a particular land as forest. So if a particular land is left fallow or something and there's a lot of trees, the forest officers can actually declare it as a forest. They can seize illegal timber, so illegal cutting of trees they can seize. So if there are trees that have been felled without the knowledge of the forest department, the forest officers can actually seize this illegal timber that has been cut down. They can arrest without warrant. So the forest officers don't necessarily need a warrant to arrest people in certain cases. If according to them the law has been broken, they can actually just arrest without a warrant also, right? If they see somebody taking out illegal timber, they can just directly arrest them and um, take them to the jail. They can confiscate any tools, vehicles, or cattle that were involved in these forest offenses. So there are certain forest offenses, like again, like taking out timber without permission, or grazing cattle. So they can actually confiscate all the tools that were used in this. They can confiscate the vehicles and cattle, and take all of these resources from the person who has been carrying out these offenses. And how do you regulate forest produce under this act? Now, because we said this act was meant to control forest produce, so how is that regulation happening? So the act controls these different forest producers like timber, bamboo, firewood, resin, and other forest products. For example, fruits and medicinal plants and all of that that comes out of the forest. This act controls all of the forest products: timber, bamboo, firewood, resin, and other products as well. Cutting, transporting, selling of any forest produce without permission is illegal. So if you are cutting timber, cutting firewood, or transporting any of these or selling these forest produce without permission, then that's entirely illegal. You need to have permission. And even transit rules, they require permits for transporting timber. So for example, somebody has permission to cut timber out of a forest. Now if they're cutting forest, so there are certain routes that have been fixed by the forest department, that if you're cutting timber from this forest and you're taking it from point A to point B, there'll be certain fixed routes that have been decided by the forest department, that you can carry this timber or the trucks filled with timber only in this particular routes. And throughout that route there'll be some checkposts, some nakas, where they'll check your truck filled with the timber that you're carrying, right? So what they'll do is they'll give you one particular transit permit at one naka, and when you go from A to B, you have to take that permit with you. And at every naka, they'll check your permit, and they'll keep the permit you received at the previous naka and give you a new permit, or they'll sign it off and something like that. And if you're missing any particular permit from point A to point B, you'll have to go back to that naka, get that permit, and only then you can cross that point. You can't like just take this transport this timber on any other route apart from the one that has been fixed by the forest department. So that is how this act regulates the transportation of the forest produce. Okay. So what are forest offenses? We said that there are these certain forest offenses. If they are if these forest offenses have been um carried out, or somebody has done any of this offense, then there will be penalties and things happening to them. So what are these forest offenses and what are these penalties that people face? So common offenses include, as you might already be aware, illegal cutting of trees, grazing cattle in restricted areas, setting forest fires, of course it's an offense, illegal removal of other forest produce which might not be timber, and poaching. And earlier, this poaching came under forest law. Now it's mostly under the wildlife law. But poaching or hunting, these are all common offenses in forests. And penalties can include fines, like money, can be include imprisonment, or basically seizing all of the tools, vehicles, or animals that have been poached, or like cattle that was taken to graze. So all of these will be, what do you call it, confiscated. And punishment will depend on, basically it can vary based on how serious the offense was, and based on whatever rules that the state has amended into the law, right? So this is all about the Indian Forest Act. And why is it important? Is because it controls illegal logging of trees or illegal felling of trees. It helps manage forest land, and it enforces forest offenses. Like these things are forest offenses and nobody can carry that out. So basically that's the importance of IFA. And many states have carried out certain changes to the act in order to strengthen the penalties. Because in old times, the penalties were like, okay, if you carry out a certain forest offense, you will have to pay 500 rupees, or you'll be in prison for 6 months. That's nothing now. So basically, many states have amended these acts in order to strengthen these penalties. So they're actually penalties to the people, or to the who are committing these offenses, right? Next is the Wildlife Protection Act. So this came up in 1972, basically when the government realized that, oops, we have done a lot of poaching, a lot of the biodiversity is gone from the country, and now they conducted a census, and oh, we don't have the same number of tigers, we don't have the same number of elephants, we need to come up with certain protection act. That's when the Wildlife Protection Act came up. What it basically does is it protects wildlife, prevents hunting, and prevents illegal trade of wildlife. Wildlife is not just animals, it's birds and plants as well. So it protects all of these, birds, plants, animals, and prevents the hunting and illegal trade. It bans hunting of most species, and it creates protected areas. So these areas are protected. You cannot carry out hunting or tree cutting in these zones. So, how does protected areas get created, or which ones get created? This act allows the government to declare national parks, sanctuaries, conservation reserves, and community reserves. So, there are four kinds of protected areas, and the government can declare an area into a national park, sanctuary, conservation reserve, or community reserve. How are these different? So, basically, you can see here in national park, no rights are allowed, no grazing is permitted. Basically, like a reserved forest. as we saw in the first act. Then wildlife sanctuary, grazing, collecting of firewood is allowed by local communities, especially the tribals in that area. And a sanctuary can be promoted to a national park, but the reverse cannot be done. A national park cannot be made into a wildlife sanctuary, but a wildlife sanctuary, if required, can be promoted to a national park. What is a conservation reserve? It's basically declared by the state government in any area owned by the government. If the area is owned by the government, they can declare it as a conservation reserve. Basically, they're trying to carry out conservation of a certain species there, or conserving the that particular area. They want to leave it undisturbed. And but the rights of the people living in the conservation reserve are not affected. For example, in wildlife sanctuaries or in national parks, the rights are completely taken away. Like the tribes cannot even go and graze their cattle, or they cannot collect firewood or anything like that. But that does not happen in a conservation reserve. The rights are unaffected. What is a community reserve? How it's different from conservation reserve? In community reserve, it is declared by the state government in any private or community owned land, but it's not it does not come under the national park, sanctuary, or a conservation reserve. So it cannot comprise of a national park, sanctuary, or a conservation reserve. But if the land is owned by a community or a private person, it can be declared by state government as a community reserve. Or like even a person themselves can go to the government and say that, okay, this is my land, can you please protect it? And then basically government can declare it as a community reserve. And again, the rights of the people living in that area are not affected. So that's all about the four types of protected areas that can be created under the Wildlife Protection Act. Moving on to hunting ban and species protection. So there's a complete ban on hunting with certain exceptions under which hunting can be carried out. For example, if a particular wild animal is has gotten uncontrolled, for example, there's a man-eating leopard or something like that, then sometimes hunting is permitted. Or for example, an animal is severely sick and nothing can be done about it, and it cannot be like helped, then hunting can be permitted. But otherwise, there's a complete ban on hunting. Species which are listed in schedules, they're listed in different schedules, and schedule 1 are the species which have the highest protection. Nobody can touch these species. And trade also in wildlife products are completely banned. So what does hunting mean? So what counts as hunting under this law? So hunting includes anything from killing an animal, poisoning an animal, trapping, capturing, injuring, attempting to kill or capture, or even driving and baiting animals for any of these purposes. If you're like baiting animals, giving them certain foods to like bring it closer to yourself to capture it, that's also counted as hunting. So anything from killing, poisoning, trapping, capturing, injuring, attempt to kill, or baiting, all of these can be counted as hunting under this act. What are counted as weapons? Things like firearms, bows, traps, nets, poison, explosive, all of these are counted as weapons under this act. So if somebody is carrying firearms or using bows or traps to capture animals, or nets, or they're poisoning certain animals, all of this is weapon. And what are the penalties? You can either get into jail, you can be fined, or your vehicles and weapons will be seized, or there will be special wildlife crime control that can happen. And all of this can happen under the Wildlife Protection Act. So in the end, what is the importance of this particular act? Basically, it has helped save many endangered species which were basically being poached, probably by people for many reasons. So it has saved those species. It has strengthened conservation of species, supported Project Tiger and other programs, and it balances conservation and human conflict. So because humans are not just allowed to kill animals, it sort of tries to balance out the wildlife human conflict. Okay. And the last law, or the last act which was discussed in this lecture, is the Forest Conservation Act, which came about in 1980. What does this act do? Is basically it prevents the misuse and diversion of forest land. So if a certain area is a forest land, how can it not be converted into something else or misused for other purposes? That is what this act is all about. Basically, no forest land can be diverted for non-forest purposes without approval from central government. So this act actually gives a little bit more authority to central government. Earlier acts, state government can make major rules in those, but this act puts some authority in the central government's hand and says that none of the forest land can actually be converted for non-forest purposes without approval from central government. So the state government cannot just carry out some mining project, some building project in an area and be like, okay, fine, I'm converting my forest into a building area. That cannot happen unless they get it approved by the central government. Okay. And if a company wants to build a highway, start mining, construct a dam, they must get approved by the central government. Okay. So this is what this act does. And what is a non-forest purpose? Like we are saying that forest land cannot be diverted for a non-forest purpose. What comes under non-forest purpose? Basically, agriculture, industry, mining, infrastructure projects, all of this comes under non-forest purposes. You cannot just convert a forest land for agriculture into fields. You cannot convert it into an industry. You cannot start mining there. You cannot make some infrastructure projects, huge ass projects, without actually getting permission from the central government. And if a forest land is being diverted, then the project authority must provide land for planting new forests. So that they must provide some land in which they can actually plant new forests, and they should pay for compensatory afforestation. So whatever money it will take to actually carry out the same amount of afforestation, they should pay for that. Now I still don't think this is enough, because for example, you might be aware of what is happening in Andamans, and they're actually trying to make a new set up a new infrastructure project there, and for that they are providing land in Haryana, which can be like forests can be set up there. But we're all aware that actually the Andaman Nicobar area is a tropical forest which has been there for a long time. And now, if you cut down that well established forest area, a lot of biodiversity will be lost from that area, and it cannot be made up for by planting a forest in Haryana. And Haryana is an entirely different landscape. It is meant for shrublands and grasslands, and there's an entirely different biogeography and biodiversity in that area, which cannot match what is going on in the Andamans, and it will destroy the local ecosystem of Haryana itself. So yeah, this is a little bit iffy, but that is what is going that is what comes under the uh, Forest Protection Act. How What is the importance of this act is that it reduces large scale deforestation. So a lot of deforestation cannot actually be conducted without getting approval by the central government. So it controls that. It strengthens the control of central government over forest and over changing of forests based on different purposes. It made environmental clearance mandatory. So basically, um, you cannot just clear up forests. There needs to be like some sort of compensation happening there. So it made that mandatory. So I've made this small table in which it talks about these different acts and how they are different from each other. So when you're going through the slides, you can actually look through this to get a quick view of how these different things are, how these different acts are different. I'll just give you a small thing. Main focus of Forest Act is to manage and control forests, and it can protect forest land and forest produce. The main focus of Protection Act is protection of wildlife, animals, and birds and plants. And for the Forest Conservation Act, they're basically focusing at conversion of forest land, and it's basically protecting forest land from being converted, right? So that is what is happening here. The Forest Act can classify the forest as reserved, protected, or village forests. Protection Act classifies species into different schedules. And because the Forest Conservation Act is not really classifying anything, it's actually just protecting the forest from being converted into something else, from converting for non-forest purposes, right? So these are the major differences. And then the Forest Act gives strong powers to forest officers. The Protection Act gives powers to wildlife authorities to prevent hunting. And the Conservation Act puts some authority in the central government's hand. And when it comes to forest land diversion, forest protection, the Forest Act provides certain kind of land regulation, allows certain kind of diversion under regulation. It's not the main focus of Protection Act because it's talking about wildlife protection. And in the Forest Conservation Act, it's strictly regulated, and the central government has the main authority over approving certain types of conversions, right? So, what are the different types of laws? The Forest Act is actually a regulatory, administrative kind of a law. Protection Act is for conservation of different plants, animals, and species. And the Conservation Act actually is a regulatory law which is trying to control how land can be converted into different for different purposes. So this was all about this week and what was discussed. We talked about threats to forest, we talked about forest fires as a major threat, and we talked about the different acts that are present in the country, and how they're helping us manage the forests and save the forests. Now it's time for a short quiz. So yeah, I hope you guys are ready to type out your answers into the chat box. We'll have a short quiz now. First question: invasive climbers increase the probability of which of these fire types? So, which of these fire types can actually be spread more by an invasive climber? Ground fire, surface fire, ladder fire, or firestorm? So, what do you guys think? You can type out your answers in the chat box. Invasive climbers increase the probability of which of these fire types? Ground, surface, ladder, or firestorm? Anyone? We discussed this in today's lecture itself. I gave you the answer. So, which of these fires can be spread by a invasive climber? C. Yes, very good. Ladder fire, because as we see, the climbers move up from the ground, from the surface towards the canopies. They can actually lead to ladder fires, which are spread from the ground to up to the canopy. Which of these forms the fire triangle? Fire, heat, air, fire, oxygen, wood, fire, air, wood, fuel, air, wood, or fuel, oxygen, and heat. So, what do you guys think? Which of these forms the fire triangle? So, yeah, you guys are correct. Sorry, I have written the wrong answer here. It should be fuel, oxygen, and heat. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Fuel, oxygen, and heat. Now, next question. A scientist uses a trap to capture a monkey. In the context of Wildlife Protection Act, trap is a weapon and capturing is hunting. Trap is not a weapon and capturing is hunting. Trap is a weapon, capturing is not hunting. Trap is not a weapon, capturing is not hunting. So, under Wildlife Protection Act, which of these is happening here if a scientist uses a trap to capture a monkey? Some people are saying it's A, the trap is a weapon and capturing is hunting. What do others think? Under the Wildlife Protection Act, we just discussed what all comes under hunting and what all comes under a weapon. So, yeah, you guys are correct. Basically, trap is a weapon and capturing is hunting under the Wildlife Protection Act. In the formula, I is equal to P into A into T, T refers to. We've already discussed this so many times, even in the last, like in the second week tutorial, we talked about I is equal to P into A into T. So, T refers to transference, time, technology, or none of the above. So, yes, you guys are correct. T refers to technology with which you can actually harvest the resources. Which of these is a stochastic factor? So, we discussed deterministic and stochastic factors which control population dynamics. Which of these is a stochastic factor? Birth rate, death rate, population structure, or a forest fire? So, which of these do you think is a stochastic factor? Yeah, people are saying forest fires. Others, what do you think? Yeah, so you guys are correct. So basically, forest fire would be a stochastic factor. As we discussed, catastrophes are stochastic factors for population structure or population dynamics. Birth rate, death rate, population structure, all of these are deterministic factors. Very good. The acronym HIPPO does not include, so the acronym HIPPO does not include habitat loss, habitat enhancement, over harvesting, human overpopulation. So, what does HIPPO not include? So, which of these things is missing from HIPPO? Habitat loss, enhancement, overharvesting, or human overpopulation? Very good. Yeah, habitat enhancement is not there. Next question. A veterinarian uses an immobilizing gun to capture a deer. In the context of Wildlife Protection Act, gun is a weapon, capturing is hunting. Not a weapon is hunting. Is a weapon is not hunting. Is not a weapon and is not hunting. So what do you think? So we're getting mixed answers here. Some of you are saying that gun is not a weapon, capturing is hunting. Some of you are saying that it's a weapon and capturing is not hunting. Okay. So anything, even attempt to capture is basically hunting. So the mobilizing gun is a weapon and capturing is hunting in this case. Now, which of these is a deterministic factor? Environmental variation, forest fire, death rate, diseases. We already discussed this. So which of these is a deterministic factor? There were three deterministic factors we discussed about just in the last question itself. Some people are saying diseases, some of you are saying forest fire, and some of you are saying death rate. So, what do you think is a deterministic factor? Environmental variation, forest fire, death rate, or diseases? So, guys, the correct answer is actually death rate. We just discussed that population dynamics depends on birth rate, death rate, population structure. These are deterministic factors. Things like sudden environmental variation, catastrophes like forest fires, or spread of diseases are stochastic factors, which can lead to extinction of a small population. So that those are stochastic factors and not deterministic factors. So the again another question about the acronym HIPPO. It does not include habitat loss, invasive species, pollination, or pollution. So what does HIPPO not include? Loss, invasive species, pollination, or pollution. Yeah, very nice. So the correct answer, this was an easy one. It's basically pollination. Conversion of forest land into agricultural or industrial land is called reforestation, afforestation, deforestation, or agroforestry. So, what is the conversion of forest land into agricultural or industrial land called? Okay. Others? Okay. Some of you are saying afforestation, and Purva has given all the options deforestation, agroforestry, and reforestation. Anybody else? Anybody else has any guesses? Deforestation, okay. Others? So, what is the conversion of forest land into industrial or agricultural land called? Okay. Basically, it is deforestation because the forest, though, is getting destroyed now. The forest is gone. Now there's actually an agricultural field or an industrial land. That does not matter. If the forest has been destroyed, it's destroyed. So it's deforestation. Reforestation is when you are actually rehabilitating a particular area. For example, you have a fallow land and you're actually planting saplings again to make a forest. Similarly, so reforestation is when it happens in a forest land which was destroyed and is made again into a forest. Afforestation is when in your fallow land you're actually making a new forest. Deforestation is when you destroy a forest, and agroforestry is a system in which you're trying to maintain a balance between agriculture and forestry. It does not have to do with conversion of forest land to agricultural land. Okay, invasive species mainly harms forests by which one of these? It's increasing biodiversity, it's replacing native species, it's improving soil fertility, or it's reducing competition. So, how is an invasive species harming a forest? Others? Any guesses? How is an invasive species harming a forest? So, yeah, we've discussed this at length now. So, an invasive species is actually replacing native species, and that is how it leads to destruction of forests. Ground fires mainly affect treetops, underground roots and organic matter, clouds, rivers. Okay, so very clear answer here, I would say. So, what are ground fires affecting? Yeah, very good. So, treetops, it cannot be. Clouds and rivers, okay. So, the correct answer is actually underground roots and organic matter because it's a ground fire. Ground fires are dangerous. Why? Because they burn slowly, because they spread through tree canopies, because they're only underground, or because they improve forest growth. So, why are ground fires dangerous? Very good. Ground fires are dangerous because they spread rapidly through tree canopies. Reserved forests under the Indian Forest Act have no restrictions, so you can do anything in the reserved forest, highest level of protection, only grazing rights, or private ownership. So, what happens in reserved forests under the Indian Forest Act? Very good. So, highest level of protection is happening in the reserved forests. Hunting of Schedule 1 species under the Wildlife Protection Act leads to no punishment, minor warning, strict penalties including imprisonment, or only a small fine. So, what will happen if you hunt a Schedule 1 species in the Protection Act? Will you get no punishment? Will you just get a warning? Will you have penalties including imprisonment or only a small fine? So, others, what do you think? Yeah, very good. If you're hunting a Schedule 1 species, you can get strict penalties including imprisonment. Thank you. This was all for the quiz today. Thank you for joining. If anybody has any doubts, you can ask me. Otherwise, thank you so much. You can exit the meeting. Thank you. Okay, I will close the meeting. Bye bye. See you guys next week.